Check this.
Hello, this is Socially Triggered, and this video is going to be about South Africa. One of the narratives that I constantly hear in South Africa is that South Africa is really meant for the black people. The black people are the true indigenous people of South Africa, and therefore they deserve all the land, and the white people should just leave, just be kicked out. But what is the truth? What is the historical truth behind South Africa? Well, if you go back several hundred years, most of South Africa was actually empty. Now, the western part of this South African country is very hard to cultivate on. It's actually very difficult land to cultivate. Whereas the eastern part of South Africa is very lush and has lots of resources. So what happened was several hundred years ago, going back about 300-400 years ago or more, the people that lived there were the San people, the Khoisan, and those people lived there fairly peacefully until two invaders came in. Now, the Dutch, they came from the west, and that was all land that was kind of empty, and really nobody wanted, even back then, the San didn't want that land because they couldn't use it. And the Dutch they had technology that allowed them to cultivate this uncultivatable land, and they basically settled that area. And then the Khoisan, they were like, well, we're fine over here, or you're fine over there. And it was pretty harmonious. However, there was a big shift that happened in Africa. And if you go back around 300 years ago, there was a man named Shaka Zulu. He was a brilliant general and king. And what happened was Shaka, he was a Bantu leader, and he led the Zulus, which is our subgroup of the Bantu people. And he basically started taking over all of southern Africa, and he pushed all the way down into South Africa with his armies. And what happened was he encountered the Khoisan. And the Khoisan were like, well, we have no hope fighting against this massive army of Zulu. And the Zulu went about slaughtering the Khoisan. They killed about 1 to 2 million of these Khoisan people. So the Khoisan had no choice, but they fled westward toward the Dutch. Now, sometimes they actually had run-ins with the Dutch where they fought with them, but other times they settled, and they would have sort of agreements where they would actually have areas where they would each kind of own land. Now, the Dutch and the Zulu met, and they actually sort of had an agreement where they basically would take land from the Khoisan. And it was it is what it is. They took the land, and they occupied it, and they controlled it. But it was land that previously the Khoi weren't really in anyways. They had just been displaced by these invading Zulu. So what happened is now you have these three groups: the Dutch, the Zulu, and the Khoisan. Now the Khoisan are just kind of getting destroyed on both ends. They're basically decimated, mainly by the Zulu. Now, fast forward a few hundred years, the Khoisan have been pretty much completely marginalized by this point. The Zulu are the majority of the blacks that live in South Africa now. They're the majority of the people that live in South Africa. and the whites represent about 10% of the population. Now the whites, there was actually a fourth group that came in, which were the British, and that's why in South Africa they speak English, because the British had a major influence within South Africa. And it was really that the British plus the Dutch. The Dutch were the farmers. The British were more like the people that were looking at the resources of the country and the gold, the diamonds, and so forth. And they were pulling that, extracting it from South Africa. The British ended up getting forced out of South Africa, but they left these three groups in place. But the British were the ones that really created a lot of the systems of government within South Africa. And they were the ones that actually created the apartheid system. So it's really important to understand that the British were there and how they influenced the country. But what's happening now is there's been a shift that has come part as apartheid has fallen. Apartheid was the system where blacks and whites were kept apart. And really, the whites had all the power, and the blacks were sort of second-class citizens within their own country. And under that system, the blacks didn't have the ability to vote. And that was a very important thing, because if they had the power to vote, well, they would vote for themselves. And that's why apartheid was kind of like one of those necessary things for the whites in South Africa to maintain, because they didn't want to be all of a sudden displaced from their own country, what they saw as their own country. Now, the blacks, they're just as much colonizers as the whites are. They're not indigenous to that area. They're not indigenous to South Africa. Because as I said, the majority of them are these Bantu people, like the Zulus, who basically were brought from the north into South Africa. They never lived there traditionally. So what happened is now you got these Zulus claiming that they are the indigenous people of all of South Africa, when that's in fact not the case. They are not the true indigenous people of South Africa. The Khoisan would be the closest to that. Now, what has happened actually over the years is the Khoisan and the Boer, which are these Dutch settlers, they mixed. And if you actually look at the genetics of the Boer, they are roughly about 8% Khoisan. So they actually have more indigenous blood than the Zulu do, which is kind of funny. So these people that are being displaced, the ones that these white South African farmers, are actually probably more biologically indigenous than the ones who are saying that they're the true indigenous people, which are these Zulu people, or Bantu, whatever way you want to call it. So the point is, it's very hypocritical that these Bantu, these Zulu Bantu people, are basically saying, well, you guys are colonizers, when they were, in fact, the original colonizers. They were the ones that slaughtered the Khoisan and stole their land, if you want to go by that. I'm not really a big fan of this whole concept of that land theft. I believe that conquest, though, is not the best way of achieving things. It's something that is natural to humans, that we've all been conquered at one point or another. And the lands that we've acquired through conquering lands is part of the human experience. So to say that it was stolen, it's hard to say, because who stole it from whom, and going back to figure out who stole what. It's not like we're just part of this land. We migrate. We take things based on whether or not we can control that area. So conquest, you can't ignore it. And I just don't like the whole concept of the idea of stolen land, because it's just not a good way to think, because it's just not realistic. Because it'd be impossible to figure out who the true owners are. And it changes hundreds of years ago when none of us were alive anyways. So, so understanding that stolen land is not really a valid term. It's important. But the point is, what's happening right now in South Africa is very hypocritical, because the ones that are claiming to be the indigenous people are truly the colonizers of South Africa. They are the Bantu people. They are not the indigenous people of South Africa. The people that have a more strong claim to being the indigenous people would be either the Khoisan or these Boer, because the Boer were occupying land that was not used by anybody. And they lived there for hundreds of years. I mean, we're talking about in the 1600s, they came to South Africa. So they have real roots in South Africa. Whereas the Zulu are more recent. So this is all a little bit of history. Hopefully you appreciate it, of South Africa, and then hopefully you understand the situation more. So when you hear these stories of evil white people colonizing South Africa, realize that this is not the full story. That's not the truth. And there's more to it. And that these people that are being displaced are actually really the indigenous people of the area. Because the white farmers of South Africa are the ones that live in the western side of South Africa. And they're being displaced on their land that they've lived on for hundreds of years. Land that no one lived on before that. Okay, so it's important to understand that what's happening in South Africa is completely wrong. So realize that what's happening in South Africa right now, where land is being taken from these white South African farmers, is just unjust. They're stealing land from their own citizens. And it's not that the government is trying to give the land back to other black people or back to the Khoisan. It's really that the government is a socialist government, and they're trying to control the land for themselves. Most of the land is owned by the government, and it's really an attempt to steal the land for the government, not to help any particular people. So it's really important to understand this. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed this history. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and give me your feedback. Tell me why land should be stolen from the whites in South Africa, or why we should do what we can to protect those people. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you. Bye.
Check this.